was 17 when my cousin poured boiling water over my arms because I wouldn't give her my college fund money. The scars tell one story, but the medical records tell another. And 3 years later, when she needed a character witness for her nursing school application, my family expected me to lie for her. They had no idea. I'd been documenting everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Cassandra, and the summer I turned 17, I learned that blood doesn't always protect you from the people who share it. I was working double shifts at the local diner, saving every penny for college. My acceptance letter to State University sat taped to my bedroom mirror, a constant reminder of the freedom waiting for me in September. The tuition deposit was due in 2 weeks, and I had exactly enough saved to cover it. My cousin Riley had different plans for my money. She dropped out of high school the year before and spent most of her time bouncing between her mother's house and whatever boyfriend would let her crash on their couch. At 19, she'd already burned through 3 jobs and 2 apartments. But that summer, she decided she wanted to be a nurse, not because she cared about helping people, but because she heard nurses made good money. The problem was, nursing programs cost money she didn't have. Money I did have. It started with small hints. Riley would come over when I was counting my tips from the diner, making comments about how lucky I was to have saved so much. She'd joke about borrowing some for her application fees, always with that laugh that wasn't really joking. When I'd politely decline, she'd get that look in her eyes. The same look she'd had as a kid when she'd break my toys and then cry to her mother that I wasn't sharing. My Aunt Monica, Riley's mother, began the campaign the 3rd week of July. She called my mom with tears in her voice, explaining how Riley had finally found direction in her life, how she just needed a little help to get started, how family was supposed to support family. The conversation always ended the same way, with my mother suggesting I consider lending Riley some of my college money, just temporarily, of course. She'd pay it back when she got her degree and started working. They all promised. But I knew Riley. I'd watched her promise to pay back lunch money in middle school and conveniently forget by dinner time. I'd seen her borrow clothes and return them stained or torn, always with some excuse about accidents. The college fund represented 3 years of my life. 16-hour weekend shifts, skipped meals, saying no to movies and dates, and everything that made high school bearable. That money wasn't just savings. It was my escape route. So when Riley cornered me in my own kitchen on July 22nd, I stood my ground. She had let herself in through the back door while my parents were at work. I was heating up leftover soup for lunch when she appeared, still in her pajamas, even though it was past noon. Her hair was unwashed, her eyes had that glazed look they got when she'd been partying too hard the night before. She started casual, leaning against the counter like we were just having a friendly chat. She asked about my shifts at the diner, complimented my new haircut, mentioned how excited she was about nursing school. Then, as I stirred my soup on the stove, she made her move. She needed $5,000 for the program, just $5,000. She'd already talked to the admissions office, and they'd hold her spot if she could get the deposit in by Friday. She knew I had it because she'd overheard Aunt Monica talking to my mom about my college savings. She promised she'd pay me back with interest when she graduated. She even had a payment plan written out on a napkin. I turned off the burner and faced her directly. I explained, as calmly as I could, that the money was for my college tuition, that I'd worked years to save it, that I'd already put down my deposit and needed every remaining dollar for books, housing, and expenses. I suggested she look into financial aid, student loans, or maybe find a job to save up for the next semester's enrollment. Riley's face changed. The fake sweetness melted away, replaced by something ugly and desperate. She raised her voice, accusing me of being selfish. She said I was being mean just because I got good grades and she didn't. She said I thought I was better than everyone else. She said family was supposed to help family, and I was proving I wasn't really family at all. I stayed calm. I told her I loved her and wanted her to succeed, but I couldn't give her my college money. I offered to help her look for jobs, to proofread her financial aid applications, to support her in ways that didn't involve my tuition fund. I thought I was being reasonable. That's when she snapped. She grabbed the pot of soup from the stove. It was one of those heavy ceramic ones my grandmother had given us, and the soup was still scalding hot. She held it above her head and screamed that if I wouldn't help her, I didn't deserve to go to college either. She said I was a selfish bitch who cared more about books than family. I tried to back away, but I was trapped between the counter and the kitchen island. Riley took 2 quick steps toward me and tilted the pot. The boiling soup hit my forearms as I threw them up to protect my face.
The pain was immediate and absolute, like someone had pressed molten metal against my skin. I screamed and fell to my knees, cradling my arms against my chest. Riley dropped the empty pot and stepped back, her face white with shock. For a moment, we both just stared at my arms. The skin was already turning red and starting to bubble. Then the shock wore off and the pain hit in waves that made me dizzy. I managed to get to the sink and run cold water over the burns, but even the gentle pressure of the tap made me cry out. Riley stood behind me, making these weird hiccuping sounds, like she might throw up. She kept saying it was an accident, that she didn't mean to actually throw it, that her hands just slipped, but I remembered the look in her eyes right before she tilted that pot. There was nothing accidental about it. The neighbors heard my screaming and called 911.
Patterson from next door came running over and found me hunched over the sink, with Riley pacing behind me, babbling about accidents and slipped hands. Mrs. Patterson took one look at my arms and started gathering ice from our freezer, talking to the emergency dispatcher on her phone with the kind of calm authority that only comes from raising 6 children. When the paramedics arrived, Riley was sitting on our front porch crying. She'd put on a performance worthy of an Academy Award, complete with shaking hands and breathless explanations about how she'd just been trying to help me make lunch and the pot was heavier than expected and her grip wasn't good and she was so sorry, so incredibly sorry. The paramedics were more focused on my injuries than her story. They wrapped my arms in sterile bandages and loaded me into the ambulance, but I could hear Riley in the background, still narrating her version of events to anyone who would listen. By the time we reached the hospital, her story had evolved. Now she'd been trying to move the pot away from the edge of the stove where it might fall. She'd been protecting me from an accident when she accidentally caused one instead. The emergency room doctor who examined me was named Dr. Sarah Chen. She was probably in her 30s, with short black hair and the kind of steady hands that made you trust her immediately. She unwrapped my arms carefully, documenting everything as she worked. The burns covered both of my forearms, from wrist to elbow, with the worst damage on my right arm where the soup had hit first. Dr. Chen asked me to explain what happened. I told her the truth. My cousin had been asking for money. I'd said no. She'd gotten angry and thrown hot soup at me. The doctor nodded and made notes, asking follow-up questions about the temperature of the soup, the type of pot, the exact sequence of events. Then she asked if this was the first time something like this had happened. I hesitated. There had been other incidents over the years, but nothing this serious. Riley pushing me downstairs when we were kids, claiming I'd tripped. Riley accidentally slamming car doors on my fingers. Riley breaking my things and then acting like it was some unfortunate mishap. But those felt different somehow. Smaller, like the kind of cousin rivalry that adults always dismissed as kids being kids. Dr. Chen must have seen something in my expression because she leaned forward slightly and spoke in a voice that was both gentle and firm. She explained that burns from thrown liquids created very specific patterns, that accidental spills looked different from intentional throws, that she'd seen enough of both to tell the difference. She said my burns were consistent with liquid being thrown with force from above. She said the splash pattern indicated I'd had my arms raised defensively. She said that in her professional opinion, these injuries were not accidental. Then she asked if I wanted her to document her findings in my medical record. I stared at her for a long moment, thinking about Riley crying on our porch, about Aunt Monica who would be arriving at the hospital soon with explanations and apologies, about my parents who would want to keep the peace and avoid family drama, about the college fund that was still sitting in my savings account, probably safe for now, but maybe not forever. I told Dr. Chen, yes, document everything. She spent the next hour taking photographs from multiple angles, measuring the affected areas and writing detailed notes about the burn patterns, depth, and likely cause. She explained each step as she worked, making sure I understood that this documentation would become part of my permanent medical record. She said it might be important later, even if I couldn't imagine why right now. When my parents arrived, they were frantic. My mom cried when she saw my bandaged arms. My dad demanded to know exactly what had happened. Riley, who had ridden to the hospital with Aunt Monica, launched into her accident story again. She'd gotten better at it during the drive over, adding details about how clumsy she'd been feeling all day, how she'd been trying to be helpful, how horrible she felt about her mistake. Aunt Monica backed up every word, adding her own commentary about how these things happen and how grateful we should be that it wasn't worse. She hugged Riley while she cried, whispering that it wasn't her fault, that accidents happen, that everything would be okay. My parents wanted to believe it was an accident. It was easier than accepting that their niece had deliberately hurt their daughter. It was easier than dealing with the family conflict that would come from accusations and blame. It was easier than accepting that someone they'd welcomed into our home could do something so deliberately cruel. But Dr. Chen pulled them aside and explained her findings. She showed them the photographs and the burn patterns. She explained in careful medical language why these injuries were not consistent with an accidental spill. She recommended that they consider filing a police report. My parents looked uncomfortable. They asked if I was sure about what happened. They wondered if maybe I was confused from the pain and shock. They suggested that maybe it wasn't as deliberate as it seemed. Maybe Riley just lost her temper and acted without thinking. Maybe it was somewhere between an accident and intentional, in that gray area where families could forgive and move on. I wasn't confused. I knew exactly what had happened and why. But I also knew my family, and I could see them already choosing the path of least resistance. So I asked Dr. Chain to make sure all of her documentation was thorough and complete. I asked her to include everything in my official medical record, regardless of what my family decided to do about it. She assured me that she would. She said that medical records were about facts, not family politics. She said that her job was to document injuries accurately, and that's exactly what she'd done. The next few days were a blur of pain medication, bandage changes, and family visits. My burns were second degree, deep enough to require careful monitoring, but not deep enough to need skin grafts. Dr. Chain referred me to a burn specialist for ongoing care and physical therapy. She said I was lucky that I'd gotten cold water on them so quickly, and that Mrs. Patterson's quick thinking with the ice had probably prevented more serious damage.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Riley visited every day, always with Aunt Monica, always with tears and apologies. She brought flowers and cards and little gifts. She sat beside my bed and held my uninjured hand while she talked about how sorry she was, how she'd never forgive herself, how she wished she could take it all back. The performance was flawless. If I hadn't been the one with soup thrown at me, I might have believed it myself. But I remembered the look in her eyes right before she tilted that pot. I remembered the calculated way she'd grabbed it, the deliberate aim, the force behind the throw. And I remembered the conversation that had preceded it, where she'd made it clear that if she couldn't have my college money, she'd make sure I couldn't use it either. My parents decided not to file a police report. They said it would tear the family apart over what was probably just a moment of poor judgment. They said Riley was clearly devastated by what she'd done and that making it into a legal matter wouldn't help anyone heal. They said forgiveness was more important than punishment, especially within families. Aunt Monica was relieved and grateful. She promised that Riley would pay for all of my medical expenses. She said they'd make sure I didn't suffer financially because of this accident. She used that word, accident, over and over as if repetition could make it true. But the medical bills were just the beginning. The burns on my right arm were deep enough to cause significant scarring. The physical therapist explained that I'd need months of rehabilitation to regain full mobility and strength. The burn specialist warned that I might always have sensitivity to heat and cold in the affected areas. The plastic surgeon consulted on my case said that while the scarring would fade over time, it would never completely disappear. More immediately, I couldn't work. My job at the diner required carrying heavy trays and working around hot stoves and fryers. With my arms bandaged and my mobility limited, I was effectively unemployed right when I needed money most. My college fund would have to cover not just tuition and housing, but also the lost income from the rest of my summer job.
Riley's nursing school applications, meanwhile, remained unfunded. She'd missed the deadline for the summer program and would have to wait until the next enrollment period. Aunt Monica suggested that maybe this was a blessing in disguise, giving Riley time to mature and really think about what she wanted to do with her life. I started college in September, with my arms still healing and my savings significantly depleted. The physical therapy appointments ate into my study time, and the pain medication made it hard to concentrate during lectures. My roommate was sympathetic, but clearly uncomfortable with the visible scarring and the daily bandage changes I still needed. I told people it was a cooking accident. It was easier than explaining about family dysfunction and deliberately thrown soup. Most people didn't ask follow-up questions, and those who did seemed satisfied with vague mentions of hot liquid and kitchen mishaps. But every time I looked at my arms, I remembered exactly what had happened. And every time I struggled to open a jar or carry a heavy bag, I was reminded of the price I'd paid for refusing to hand over my college fund. The worst part wasn't the physical recovery, though. The worst part was watching my family rewrite history. Within a month, Riley's accident story had evolved into something almost heroic. She'd been helping me with lunch when a terrible mishap occurred. She'd been devastated by what happened and had learned so much about being careful in the kitchen. She'd been inspired by her experience with my recovery to pursue nursing even more seriously, because now she understood suffering firsthand. By Christmas, the story has shifted again. Riley had been cooking for me because I'd been working so hard and looked tired. She'd been trying to take care of me when the accident happened. It was a reminder that good intentions sometimes lead to unfortunate outcomes, but the love behind the actions was what mattered. By spring, some family members seemed to believe that I'd been the one cooking when the accident happened and that Riley had just been unlucky enough to be nearby when I spilled soup on myself. I corrected this version when I heard it, but I could see the uncomfortable looks that followed, like I was being unnecessarily difficult by insisting on accuracy. Riley, meanwhile, had enrolled in a certified nursing assistant program at the community college. It was shorter and cheaper than the full nursing degree she'd originally wanted, but Aunt Monica presented it as a mature compromise. Riley was starting smaller and working her way up, showing real growth and responsibility. She was excelling in the program according to all reports. Her instructors praised her compassion and her commitment to helping others. She volunteered at local health clinics and participated in community health screenings. She seemed to have found her calling in healthcare. The irony wasn't lost on me. The person who had deliberately burned my arms was now training to take care of other people's injuries. But I was focused on my own recovery and my own education. The physical therapy was helping, and I'd regained most of the mobility in my arms. The scarring was fading slowly, and I'd learned to manage the ongoing sensitivity issues. My grades were good, despite the challenging start to the year, and I'd found a work-study job in the university library that didn't require heavy lifting. I thought the worst was behind me. Then, during my sophomore year, Riley applied to transfer into a full Bachelor of Science in Nursing program at a more prestigious college. The application required character references from family members, people who could speak to her personal integrity and her suitability for a career in healthcare. Aunt Monica called my mother in March, explaining how important this application was for Riley's future, how she'd worked so hard to turn her life around after some youthful mistakes, how she'd proven her dedication through her excellent performance in the CNA program, how this nursing degree would give her the stability and purpose she'd been searching for. The application was due in 2 weeks, and they needed character references from people who knew Riley well. Family members would be ideal, since they could speak to her long-term growth and development, people who had seen her mature and evolve into the caring person she'd become. My mother agreed to write a reference letter. So did my father. So did Riley's grandmother and 2 of her aunts. But the application allowed for up to 6 references, and more letters would make the application stronger. They wanted me to write one too. The request came through my mother, who approached it carefully. She acknowledged that I might have complicated feelings about Riley because of the kitchen accident. She understood that it might be difficult for me to think about Riley working in healthcare, given what had happened. But she pointed out that the accident had happened over a year ago, and Riley had grown so much since then. She said that in some ways I was the perfect person to write about Riley's character growth. I'd seen her at her worst moment when she'd made a terrible mistake that hurt someone she loved, but I'd also seen how devastated she'd been afterward, how hard she'd worked to make amends, how committed she'd become to helping others. A reference letter from me would be especially meaningful because it would show that even the person she'd accidentally hurt could see her potential as a healthcare provider.
It would demonstrate forgiveness and family unity. It would prove that Riley had learned from her mistakes and earned the trust of the people closest to her. I told my mother I'd think about it, but I already knew my answer. I just needed to figure out how to deliver it in a way that wouldn't destroy what was left of my relationship with my family. Because Riley hadn't grown or changed or learned from her mistakes. She'd just gotten better at managing her image and telling her story. The accident narrative had become so polished and rehearsed that I suspected she'd started to believe it herself. But I had Dr. Chen's medical records. I had photographs of burn patterns that told the truth about thrown liquid rather than accidental spills. I had documentation that proved exactly what had happened in my kitchen that day, regardless of what story my family preferred to tell. And now they wanted me to lie for Riley. They wanted me to put my name and my integrity behind a recommendation that would help her get access to vulnerable patients. They wanted me to ignore what I knew about her capacity for deliberate harm when she didn't get what she wanted. I spent 2 weeks thinking about it, researching nursing program requirements and rereading my medical records from that day. Dr. Chen had been thorough in her documentation. The photographs were clear, the measurements were precise, and her professional conclusions were unambiguous. I also spent time thinking about forgiveness, about family loyalty, about second chances and personal growth. I wanted to believe that people could change, that Riley had genuinely learned from what she'd done. But I kept coming back to the fact that she'd never actually acknowledged what she'd done. You can't learn from mistakes you refuse to admit making. The night before the application deadline, my mother called to remind me about the reference letter. She said Riley was really counting on my support and that it would mean so much to her to have my blessing on this new chapter of her life. I told my mother that I wouldn't be writing a reference letter for Riley. The silence on the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then my mother asked why, in a voice that sounded genuinely confused. I explained that I didn't feel comfortable recommending someone for a healthcare career when I had concerns about their judgment and impulse control. I said that nursing requires working with vulnerable people and that character references should be honest assessments of someone's suitability for that responsibility. My mother asked what concerns I could possibly have. Riley had been nothing but caring and supportive during my recovery. She'd learned so much from the experience. She dedicated herself to helping others specifically because she understood how much damage accidents could cause. I told my mother that it hadn't been an accident. Another long silence. Then my mother asked what I meant. I explained what Dr. Chen had documented, the burn patterns that were consistent with thrown liquid rather than accidental spills, the force and angle required to create the injuries I'd sustained, the professional medical opinion that my burns were not accidental. My mother's voice got tight. She said that was ridiculous. She'd been there at the hospital. She'd seen how upset Riley was. She'd seen the accident report and the medical records. There was nothing in any of that documentation suggesting intentional harm. I told her that was because she'd only seen the basic incident report, not Dr. Chen's detailed forensic analysis. I offered to show her the complete medical records, including the photographs and measurements that proved the liquid had been thrown deliberately. My mother said she didn't need to see anything like that. She said it was unhealthy for me to be holding on to anger and conspiracy theories about family members.
She said that even if Riley had lost her temper for a moment, that didn't mean she'd intended to cause serious harm. She said people make mistakes when they're emotional, and that didn't make them monsters. I told my mother that throwing boiling soup at someone wasn't a mistake, it was assault, and that I wouldn't help Riley get access to vulnerable patients when she'd proven herself willing to hurt people who didn't give her what she wanted. My mother hung up on me. Within an hour, my phone was buzzing with calls and texts from other family members. Aunt Monica crying about how I was trying to destroy Riley's future over a long-resolved accident. My father asking me to please reconsider and not let old hurt feelings interfere with family harmony. My grandmother disappointed that I was holding grudges instead of supporting family members who were trying to build better lives. Riley herself called last, her voice thick with tears. She said she understood that I might still be angry about what happened, but she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive her mistake. She said she'd spent every day since the accident thinking about how to make amends, and that her decision to pursue nursing was directly inspired by wanting to help people the way she wished she could have helped me. She said she didn't deserve my support, but she was asking for it anyway because she'd changed so much since that terrible day. She said she'd learned to control her emotions, to think before acting, to put other people's well-being ahead of her own desires. She said that if I couldn't write a positive reference letter, she understood, but she hoped I wouldn't actively try to sabotage her application. I told Riley that I had no intention of contacting her nursing program unprompted, but I also wouldn't lie if anyone asked me directly about her character or her suitability for healthcare work. Riley asked what that meant. I told her it meant that if her nursing program called to verify information, I'd tell them the truth about what happened between us. I'd explain that she'd deliberately thrown boiling soup at me when I refused to give her money, and that she'd never acknowledged the intentional nature of her actions. Riley started crying harder. She said that would ruin everything she'd worked for. She said it wasn't fair to hold one moment of poor judgment against her for the rest of her life. She said she'd proven she'd changed through her actions over the past year and a half. I told Riley that people who work with vulnerable populations need to be held to high standards, that patients deserve healthcare providers who won't hurt them when frustrated or angry, that character matters in healthcare, and character is demonstrated through honesty about past mistakes as much as through current good behavior. Riley said I was being cruel and vindictive. She said I was letting my own bitterness destroy her dreams. She said that if I really cared about helping vulnerable people, I'd give someone who'd made mistakes a chance to make amends through service. I told Riley that she could make amends by telling the truth about what she'd done and why she'd done it, that she could demonstrate growth by taking responsibility instead of hiding behind accident stories.
That she could show she'd changed by acknowledging the severity of what she'd done instead of minimizing it as a moment of poor judgment. Riley hung up on me too. The next morning, I got a text from my mother. Riley had withdrawn her nursing program application. The family was disappointed in my decision to prioritize old grudges over supporting someone's efforts to build a better life. They hoped I'd be able to forgive eventually, but they understood if I needed more time. I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I called Dr. Chen's office and asked for copies of my complete medical records from the day I was treated for burns. The receptionist said they could mail them to me, but it would take a few days. I told her I wasn't in a hurry. I just wanted to make sure I had everything documented and accessible in case I ever needed it in the future. Because I had a feeling this wasn't over. Riley didn't strike me as someone who gave up on things she wanted just because of one setback. And healthcare was a big field with lots of programs and lots of opportunities for people who were persistent. I wanted to be prepared for the next time she applied somewhere. I wanted to have the documentation ready if anyone called to ask about her character or her history. I wanted to make sure that the truth about what happened in my kitchen that day was preserved and accessible, regardless of what stories my family preferred to tell. Dr. Chen had been right when she said the documentation might be important later, even if I couldn't imagine why at the time. Now I knew exactly why it mattered.
The truth has a way of becoming important when people start building their futures on lies. 6 months after Riley withdrew her nursing program, I received an unexpected phone call at my dorm room. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Dr. Margaret Torres, Director of Student Affairs at Riverside Community College's nursing program. She apologized for calling so late in the evening, but she had some questions about a student who had listed me as a personal reference on her application. The student's name was Riley Martinez. I felt my stomach drop. Martinez was Aunt Monica's maiden name, and Riley had apparently decided to use it instead of her usual surname. Dr. Torres explained that Riley had submitted what appeared to be a very strong application to their accelerated nursing program. Her grades from her CNA certification were excellent, her volunteer work was impressive, and her personal statement about overcoming family tragedy to find her calling in healthcare was quite moving. However, Dr. Torres said, something about the application had raised a small red flag during their review process. Riley had listed several family members as character references, but when they'd attempted to contact me for verification, they'd discovered that Riley had provided an incorrect phone number. The number she'd given connected to a disconnected line, and the address listed for me didn't match any current records they could find. Dr. Torres wondered if I might be willing to speak with her about Riley's character and suitability for their nursing program. I told Dr. Torres that I'd be happy to discuss Riley's character, but that I'd prefer to do so in writing rather than over the phone. I explained that there were some complex family dynamics involved, and I wanted to make sure I provided accurate and complete information for their review. Dr. Torres agreed and provided me with her email address. She said she'd appreciate receiving my written assessment within the next week as they were finalizing their admissions decisions for the upcoming semester. After I hung up, I sat in my dorm room for a long time thinking about what Riley had done. She'd applied to a different nursing program using a different name, hoping that her past wouldn't follow her. She'd deliberately provided incorrect contact information for me, probably gambling that the program wouldn't try very hard to verify references from family members. But she'd underestimated how thorough some admissions committees could be. I spent the next 2 days crafting my response to Dr. Torres. I started by explaining that Riley Martinez was actually Riley Coleman, and that she was my first cousin. I provided her correct legal name and date of birth in case they wanted to verify her identity or conduct any background checks. Then I described the incident from July of my senior year of high school. I kept the language factual and professional, avoiding emotional commentary while making sure all the relevant details were included. I explained that Riley had asked me for $5,000 from my college fund, that I had declined, and that she had subsequently thrown boiling soup at my arms, while stating that if she couldn't have the money, I didn't deserve to go to college either. I described my injuries in clinical terms, the emergency room treatment I received, and the professional medical assessment that concluded my burns were consistent with deliberately thrown liquid rather than accidental spillage. I included the date of the incident, the name of the treating hospital, and Dr. Chen's name and department in case they wanted to verify any of the information. I explained that Riley had maintained that the incident was accidental, despite clear medical evidence to the contrary. I noted that she had never acknowledged the intentional nature of her actions or taken responsibility for deliberately causing harm. I mentioned that she had previously applied to another nursing program and had withdrawn her application when family members declined to provide character references. I concluded by stating that while I hoped Riley had genuinely changed since the incident, I had serious concerns about her suitability for a healthcare career based on her demonstrated willingness to cause physical harm when she didn't get what she wanted, and her ongoing dishonesty about the circumstances of that incident. I attached copies of my medical records from Dr. Chen, including the photographs and detailed analysis of the burn patterns. I also included a copy of the original incident report from the emergency room, which contained Riley's initial statement about the circumstances. Before sending the email, I read through 3 times to make sure everything was accurate and professionally presented. I wasn't trying to be vindictive or emotional. I was simply providing factual information that I believed was relevant to assessing someone's character for a position involving vulnerable people. I hit send at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night. Dr. Torres responded the next morning. She thanked me for the comprehensive information and assured me that they would review it carefully as part of their admissions process. She said that they took character assessments very seriously, particularly given the level of trust placed in nursing professionals. She noted that the discrepancy between the name on the application and the information I'd provided would require additional verification before they could proceed. She also mentioned that they would likely need to contact Dr. Chen's office to verify the medical documentation I'd provided and asked if I had any objection to them doing so. I told her I had no objection and provided Dr. Chen's current contact information. 2 weeks later, I received another email from Dr. Torres. Riley's application was rejected. The admissions committee had determined that there were significant concerns about both her honesty in the application process and her suitability for patient care responsibilities. Dr. Torres thanked me again for providing the information they needed to make an informed decision. I didn't tell anyone in my family about the phone call or my response.
I figured they'd find out about Riley's rejection soon enough, and I preferred not to be the one to deliver that news. Sure enough, Aunt Monica called my mother 3 days later. Riley had been devastated to learn that her nursing application had been rejected. The school had cited concerns about her character and fitness for healthcare work, but they hadn't provided specific details about what had raised those concerns. Riley was convinced that someone had sabotaged her application, but she couldn't figure out who or how. My mother, to her credit, immediately suspected what had happened. She called me that evening and asked directly if I'd had any contact with Riley's nursing program. I told her about Dr. Torres's phone call and my written response. I explained that I'd simply provided factual information when asked directly by admissions staff. I hadn't sought out the program or volunteered negative information, but when they'd contacted me for verification, I told them the truth. My mother was furious. She said I deliberately sabotaged Riley's future out of spite. She said I was holding a grudge over an accident that had happened years ago. She said I was being cruel and vindictive, and that I'd proven I cared more about hurting Riley than about family unity. I told my mother that nursing programs had a responsibility to protect patients from potentially harmful healthcare providers, that they had asked me directly about Riley's character, and I had provided honest information, that hiding the truth about someone's history of deliberately causing physical harm wouldn't protect anyone. My mother said that everyone deserves second chances, and that Riley had proven she'd changed through her volunteer work and her excellent performance in her CNA program. She said I was being unreasonable and unforgiving. I told my mother that second chances didn't have to include access to vulnerable patients, that Riley could rebuild her life and prove she'd changed in many other ways that didn't involve working in healthcare, that some career paths require higher standards of character because of the trust and responsibility involved. My mother said I was being self-righteous and judgmental. She said I had no right to play God with other people's futures. She said I was letting my own bitterness poison my judgment. The conversation ended with my mother telling me that I damaged my relationship with the family beyond repair and that she hoped I was satisfied with the hurt I'd caused. After she hung up, I felt exhausted, but not guilty. I'd done what I believed was right, and I'd done it honestly and professionally. If Riley wanted a career in healthcare, she needed to start by being honest about her past and taking responsibility for her actions. Until she did that, I couldn't recommend her for positions involving patient care. Over the next few months, my relationship with most of my extended family effectively ended. Aunt Monica stopped speaking to me entirely. My cousins on that side of the family unfriended me on social media and stopped inviting me to gatherings. My grandmother expressed disappointment that I'd chosen revenge over forgiveness. My parents maintained contact, but our conversations became strained and infrequent. They clearly felt I'd gone too far in my response to Riley's nursing application, and they seemed to blame me for the family discord that followed. But I also started hearing from other people.
Dr. Chen's office called to let me know that they'd provided verification of my medical records to a Riverside Community College and that they'd been impressed by the thoroughness of the program's background check process. Dr. Chen herself got on the phone to tell me that she was glad to see that her documentation had been useful and that she hoped other medical professionals would be as careful about patient safety. Mrs. Patterson, our former neighbor, reached out after hearing through the grapevine about the family conflict. She said she'd always wondered about Riley's story regarding the incident in our kitchen because the scene she'd found when she'd come running over hadn't looked like any kitchen accident she'd ever seen. She said she was proud of me for standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. My college roommate, who had witnessed some of my recovery process, told me she thought I'd made the right choice. She said she wouldn't want someone like Riley taking care of her if she were ever hospitalized. Most surprisingly, I heard from other people who had dealt with similar situations in their own families. A woman whose brother had been denied a teaching position after family members provided honest character references about his inappropriate behavior with children. A man whose cousin had been rejected from a police academy after relatives disclosed his history of domestic violence. These conversations helped me understand that I wasn't alone in facing the difficult choice between family loyalty and public safety, that sometimes protecting strangers from potentially harmful individuals required being honest about uncomfortable family truths. But the situation with Riley was far from over. 8 months after her rejection from Riverside Community College, I learned that she'd applied to 3 other nursing programs in different states. She was using Riley Martinez as her legal name now, having gone through the process of officially changing it. She'd also moved to Oregon, where she was establishing new residency and creating distance from her history in our home state. I found out about this through my cousin Jake, Riley's younger brother, who had remained on speaking terms with me despite the family conflict. Jake was genuinely conflicted about Riley's situation. He loved his sister and wanted her to succeed, but he'd also been present for some of her more troubling behavior over the years. He's the one who told me that Riley had legally changed her name and moved away specifically to escape the consequences of what she'd done to me. Jake also told me something else that I found deeply troubling. Riley had been telling people in Oregon that she'd been inspired to pursue nursing after caring for a family member who'd been severely burned in a kitchen accident. She was presenting herself as someone who had personal experience with burn recovery and understood the challenges that burn survivors faced. She was literally using my injury and recovery as part of her application narrative, while simultaneously hiding the fact that she was the one who had caused that injury and recovery. Jake said he had tried to talk to Riley about being more honest in her applications, but she told him that what happened in the past was irrelevant to her future career. She said she'd learned from her mistakes and grown as a person, and that she shouldn't have to pay for one moment of poor judgment for the rest of her life. But Riley still wasn't calling it anything more than poor judgment. She still wasn't acknowledging that she'd deliberately hurt me. She was still presenting it as an unfortunate accident that had somehow inspired her career choice. Jake asked me what he thought he should do. He didn't want to sabotage his sister's future, but he was uncomfortable with her dishonesty. He was also worried about what might happen if she became a nurse and found herself in high-stress situations with difficult patients. I told Jake that I appreciated him keeping me informed, but that I couldn't tell him what to do about his sister. I said that each person had to make their own decisions about what they could live with. But I also told Jake that if any of Riley's new nursing programs contacted me for character verification, I would provide the same factual information I'd given to Riverside Community College. I said that Riley's geographical relocation and name change didn't alter the facts about what had happened between us. Jake nodded and said he understood. He also said he hoped Riley would eventually take real responsibility for her actions, because he thought that was the only way she'd be able to move forward genuinely. That conversation with Jake got me thinking about what Riley might do if she was admitted to a nursing program and eventually became licensed. Would she continue to hide her past indefinitely? What would happen if she found herself in a situation where a patient or family member frustrated her? What safeguards existed to protect people from healthcare providers who had histories of deliberately causing harm? I decided to do some research. I learned that nursing license applications typically include questions about criminal history, but they didn't always ask about incidents that hadn't resulted in criminal charges.
Since my family had decided not to file a police report about what Riley had done, there was no criminal record for future employers or licensing boards to discover. I also learned that character references from family members were often viewed as less reliable than references from employers, professors, or community leaders. Family members were assumed to be biased in favor of applicants, so negative information from relatives might actually carry more weight than positive information. Most importantly, I learned that nursing licenses were issued by state boards that had the authority to investigate complaints about licensed practitioners. If Riley did become a nurse, and if she ever harmed a patient or demonstrated unfitness for practice, her license could be suspended or revoked. But by that point, damage might already have been done to vulnerable people who trusted her with their care. I began to understand that the character reference process wasn't just about determining who got admitted to nursing programs. It was about protecting future patients from potentially harmful healthcare providers. And that responsibility felt heavier than family loyalty or concerns about second chances. Around this time, I also started following some online communities for burn survivors and their families. I wanted to connect with other people who had experienced similar injuries and understand their perspectives on recovery, scarring, and long-term effects. What I found in these communities was both heartbreaking and enlightening. Many burn survivors talked about the importance of having healthcare providers who understood the unique challenges they faced. They emphasized how crucial it was to have nurses and doctors who were patient, gentle, and emotionally supportive during treatment and recovery. They also talked about negative experiences with healthcare providers who seemed uncomfortable with burn injuries, who were rough during dressing changes, or who made insensitive comments about scarring and appearance. Reading these stories made me think about Riley in a new way. Not just as my cousin who had hurt me, but as someone who might interact with other burn survivors in her potential role as a nurse. Someone who had deliberately caused the type of injury that these community members were working so hard to heal from. The idea that Riley might someday be responsible for changing dressings on burned patients, while never acknowledging that she had deliberately inflicted similar injuries, felt deeply wrong to me. I also connected with some advocacy organizations that worked on healthcare safety and patient protection issues. I learned about the complex systems designed to prevent harmful individuals from gaining access to vulnerable patient populations and about the ongoing challenges those systems faced. One conversation that particularly stuck with me was with a woman named Patricia who worked for a nonprofit focused on healthcare accountability. She explained that most people don't realize how much they depend on the integrity of the character reference process when they're patients in hospitals or care facilities. Patricia said that when someone is sedated, in pain, confused, or otherwise vulnerable, they have to trust that their healthcare providers have been properly screened for both competence and character. Families trust that the nurses caring for their loved ones won't take advantage of that vulnerability or cause harm when frustrated. She said that people who provided character references for healthcare professionals were essentially vouching for that trust. They were telling licensing boards and employers that this person could be trusted with some of the most vulnerable members of society. Patricia asked me what I would want someone to do if they had knowledge about a potential healthcare provider's history of deliberately causing physical harm. Would I want them to stay silent to preserve family relationships, or would I want them to speak up to protect patients they'd never meet? The answer seemed obvious when she put it that way. In November of my junior year, I received another phone call. This time, it was from the admissions office at Pacific Northwest University's nursing program. A student named Riley Martinez had listed me as a personal reference, but the contact information she'd provided seemed to be outdated. The admissions counselor, Miss Jennifer Walsh, explained that they were conducting more thorough reference checks than usual because they'd recently had some issues with applicants providing false information.
She said they'd been able to track down my current contact information through university records, and they hoped I could provide some insight into Miss Martinez's character and suitability for nursing. I told Miss Walsh that I'd be happy to provide information about Riley, but that I'd need to clarify some facts about her identity and background first. I explained that Riley Martinez was formerly Riley Coleman, and that she was my cousin. I mentioned that she'd apparently changed her name recently, possibly to distance herself from her previous application history. Miss Walsh made notes and said that name changes weren't necessarily disqualifying, but they did require additional verification. She asked if I could provide Riley's previous name and any other identifying information that might help them conduct a more thorough background check. I provided Riley's full legal name from before the change, her date of birth, and her social security number, which I remembered from various family financial documents over the years. I also mentioned that she'd previously applied to at least 2 other nursing programs that I was aware of. Miss Walsh thanked me for the information and said they'd want to schedule a more detailed phone interview about Riley's character and background. We arranged a time for the following week. During that phone interview, I provided the same factual account I'd given to Dr. Torres at Riverside Community College. I described the incident with the boiling soup, my injuries, the medical documentation, and Riley's ongoing denial about the intentional nature of her actions. I also mentioned her pattern of applying to multiple nursing programs under different names and providing incorrect contact information for references. Miss Walsh asked thoughtful questions about the timeline, the medical treatment I'd received, and my assessment of Riley's current character based on her behavior since the incident. I answered honestly, emphasizing that while I hoped Riley had changed, I hadn't seen evidence of genuine accountability or insight into the seriousness of what she'd done. Miss Walsh said they'd review all the information carefully and might need to contact Dr. Chen's office for verification of the medical records. I provided Dr. Chen's current contact information and said I had no objection to them verifying any of the details I'd shared. 3 weeks later, I learned that Riley's application to Pacific Northwest University had also been rejected. This time, however, the rejection had broader consequences. Jake called to tell me that the nursing program had shared their findings with a national database that tracked applicants who had provided false information or misrepresented their backgrounds. Riley's use of multiple names, incorrect contact information, and failure to disclose relevant character information was flagged in the system. This meant that other nursing programs would be able to see that Riley had a history of dishonest application practices, even if they didn't have access to the specific details about what had happened between us. Jake said Riley was devastated. She'd finally realized that her past was going to follow her, regardless of where she moved or what name she used. She was talking about giving up on nursing entirely and pursuing some other career path. But Jake also said something that surprised me. Riley had finally started talking honestly about what had happened in our kitchen. Not to the family, who she knew wouldn't believe a different version at this point, but to a therapist she'd started seeing in Oregon. According to Jake, Riley had admitted to the therapist that she'd thrown the soup deliberately when she was angry about not getting the money. She acknowledged that it wasn't an accident and that she'd tried to hurt me because she was frustrated. She was apparently working with the therapist on understanding why she'd done it and how to prevent similar behavior in the future. Jake said the therapist had told Riley that acknowledging the truth was an important first step, but that she'd need to do more work on taking responsibility and making genuine amends before she could move forward. Part of that work, according to the therapist, would involve being honest with our family about what had really happened, rather than continuing to maintain the accident story. Jake wasn't sure if Riley would actually follow through with that recommendation, but he thought I should know that she was at least starting to be honest with someone about what she'd done. I told Jake that I was glad to hear Riley was getting professional help, and that I hoped the therapy would help her develop better coping strategies and more insight into her behavior. But I also told him that therapy didn't erase the past, and that Riley would still need to demonstrate sustained change over time before I'd be comfortable with her working in healthcare. Jake agreed and said he thought his sister had a lot of work to do before she'd be ready for the kind of responsibility that came with being a nurse. After that conversation, I felt something I hadn't expected, a small sense of relief. Not because Riley's nursing ambitions had been derailed, but because she was finally starting to tell the truth about what had happened. Even if it was only to her therapist, it felt like a step toward genuine accountability.
I also felt vindicated in my decision to provide honest character references when asked. The system had worked the way it was supposed to work. Programs had gathered information, conducted thorough background checks, and made decisions based on a complete picture of an applicant's character and history. Riley hadn't been denied opportunities because of vindictive family members. She'd been denied opportunities because she demonstrated poor judgment, dishonesty, and a willingness to cause deliberate harm. Those were legitimate disqualifying factors for healthcare careers, regardless of family relationships or second chances. But the story still wasn't over. In the spring of my senior year, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Riley, postmarked from Oregon, written in her familiar handwriting on plain white paper. The letter started with an acknowledgement that she probably didn't have the right to contact me, and that she'd understand if I didn't want to read what she had to say. But she said she needed to tell me some things that she should have said years ago. Riley wrote that she'd been in therapy for several months, working on understanding why she'd done what she'd done and how to make sure she never did anything like it again. She said that she'd finally been honest with her therapist about the incident in our kitchen and that it had been one of the hardest things she'd ever done. She acknowledged that she'd thrown the soup at me deliberately because she was angry about not getting the money. She said there was no excuse for what she'd done and that calling it an accident had been a lie designed to protect herself from consequences. She apologized for the pain she'd caused me, both physical and emotional. She apologized for the medical bills, the lost work time, the ongoing effects of the scarring, and the family conflict that had resulted from her actions. She also apologized for trying to hide from her past by changing her name and moving away. She said she'd realized that running away from what she'd done wasn't the same as taking responsibility for it. Riley wrote that she understood why I'd provided honest information to the nursing programs that had contacted me. She said that she would have done the same thing if the situation had been reversed. She said that patients deserve to be protected from people who might hurt them, and that she hadn't earned the right to work in healthcare. She said she was giving up on pursuing nursing, not because the applications had been rejected, but because she'd come to understand that she wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. Her therapist had helped her see that wanting to help people wasn't the same as being safe to work with vulnerable populations. Riley wrote that she was planning to pursue a different career path, something that would allow her to contribute positively to society without putting vulnerable people at risk. She was thinking about social work, but in administrative or policy roles rather than direct client contact. She said she hoped someday she might be able to demonstrate genuine change and earn some measure of forgiveness, but that she understood if that never happened. She said she was committed to doing the work on herself, regardless of whether it repaired our relationship. The letter ended with another apology and a statement that she wouldn't contact me again unless I indicated that I was open to communication. I read the letter 3 times, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief that Riley was finally telling the truth about what had happened. There was appreciation for her acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused. There was cautious hope that she might genuinely be working to change. But there was also wariness. Riley had been good at telling people what they wanted to hear for most of her life. The fact that she was now telling a therapist and me what we probably wanted to hear didn't necessarily mean she'd fundamentally changed. Still, the letter felt different from her previous apologies. It was more specific, more accountable, and less focused on getting something from me in return. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or requesting that I change my position about her fitness for healthcare work. She was simply acknowledging what she'd done and taking responsibility for it. I decided to respond, but briefly. I wrote back that I appreciated her honesty about what had happened and that I hoped her therapy continued to be helpful. I said that I was glad she'd decided not to pursue nursing, as I believed that was the right decision given her history. I wished her well in finding a career path that was better suited to her current level of personal development. I didn't offer forgiveness or suggest rebuilding our relationship. I wasn't ready for that, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. But I acknowledged her letter and her apparent efforts to take responsibility. Riley wrote back once more, just a brief note thanking me for responding and saying that she understood my position. She said she hoped that someday her actions would demonstrate genuine change, even if our relationship never recovered. After that, we didn't communicate again. But Jake kept me updated on Riley's progress, and what I heard was encouraging. She'd found work as a data analyst for a nonprofit organization that advocated for healthcare policy reform. She was using her knowledge of healthcare systems, gained through her CNA training and nursing program research, to help identify gaps in patient safety regulations.
She was still in therapy, according to Jake, and she'd started being honest with the family about what had really happened between us. It had caused some upheaval, as several family members had to reconcile their years of defending her accident story with the reality of what she'd actually done. Some family members, including Aunt Monica, had trouble accepting the new version of events. Others, like my grandmother, said they'd suspected there was more to the story but hadn't wanted to believe that Riley could have done something so deliberately harmful. My parents had mixed reactions. My mother was upset that she'd been defending an inaccurate version of events for years, but she was also relieved that Riley was finally taking responsibility. My father said he was disappointed in Riley's past dishonesty, but proud of her current efforts to make amends. Jake also told me that Riley had started volunteering with a burn survivor support group, but not as a caregiver or counselor. She helped with administrative tasks and fundraising, working behind the scenes to support people whose injuries were similar to the ones she'd caused me. She'd been honest with the organization, according to Jake. She told them that she had a family member who'd been severely burned and that she'd been responsible for causing those injuries. The organization had been initially hesitant about her involvement, but they'd eventually decided that her administrative skills were valuable and that her personal understanding of the impact of burn injuries could be channeled into productive advocacy work. I wasn't sure how I felt about Riley working with burn survivors, even in a non-direct care capacity. Part of me worried that she was inserting herself into spaces where she might encounter vulnerable people, even if she wasn't providing hands-on care. But another part of me recognized that if Riley was going to make genuine amends for what she'd done, working to support other burn survivors might be an appropriate way to do that. As long as she was honest about her history and worked within appropriate boundaries, her involvement might actually be beneficial. The most important thing from my perspective was that she was no longer pursuing work that would give her direct access to vulnerable patients. Her character references had served their intended purpose, protecting potential patients from someone who had demonstrated a willingness to cause deliberate harm when frustrated. As I finished my senior year of college and prepared for graduation, I felt a sense of closure about the whole situation. Riley had been prevented from gaining access to vulnerable patients through the healthcare system. She'd finally acknowledged the truth about what she'd done. She appeared to be working on genuine personal change rather than just managing her image. Most importantly, I'd learned that doing the right thing sometimes meant choosing patient safety over family harmony. That character references were about more than just helping relatives achieve their career goals. They were about protecting vulnerable people from potentially harmful individuals. The scars on my arms had faded significantly over the years, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. They served as a daily reminder of what Riley had done, but also of what I'd survived and overcome. I'd finished college despite the challenges her actions had created. I'd maintained my integrity despite family pressure to compromise it. I'd protected unknown future patients despite personal costs. Looking back, I realized that Dr. Chen had been right when she'd encouraged me to document everything that day in the emergency room. The documentation had served its purpose, not just in my own medical care, but in protecting others from potential harm. As I finished my senior year of college and prepared for graduation, I felt a sense of closure about the whole situation. Riley had been prevented from gaining access to vulnerable patients through the healthcare system. She'd finally acknowledged the truth about what she'd done. She appeared to be working on genuine personal change rather than just managing her image. Most importantly, I'd learned that doing the right thing sometimes meant choosing patient safety over family harmony. That character references were about more than just helping relatives achieve their career goals. They were about protecting vulnerable people from potentially harmful individuals. The scars on my arms had faded significantly over the years, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. They served as a daily reminder of what Riley had done, but also of what I'd survived and overcome. I'd finished college despite the challenges her actions had created. I'd maintained my integrity despite family pressure to compromise it. I'd protected unknown future patients despite personal costs. Looking back, I realized that Dr. Chen had been right when she'd encouraged me to document everything that day in the emergency room. The documentation had served its purpose, not just in my own medical care, but in protecting others from potential harm. As I finished my senior year of college and prepared for graduation, I felt a sense of closure about the whole situation. Riley had been prevented from gaining access to vulnerable patients through the healthcare system. She'd finally acknowledged the truth about what she'd done. She appeared to be working on genuine personal change rather than just managing her image. Most importantly, I'd learned that doing the right thing sometimes meant choosing patient safety over family harmony. That character references were about more than just helping relatives achieve their career goals. They were about protecting vulnerable people from potentially harmful individuals. The scars on my arms had faded significantly over the years, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. They served as a daily reminder of what Riley had done, but also of what I'd survived and overcome. I'd finished college despite the challenges her actions had created. I'd maintained my integrity despite family pressure to compromise it. I'd protected unknown future patients despite personal costs. Looking back, I realized that Dr. Chen had been right when she'd encouraged me to document everything that day in the emergency room. The documentation had served its purpose, not just in my own medical care, but in protecting others from potential harm.
Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply tell the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable for everyone involved. 5 years after my college graduation, I was working as a patient safety coordinator at Metropolitan General Hospital when I received a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was professional but concerned, introducing herself as Dr. Linda Vasquez, Chief of Staff at Sacred Heart Medical Center across town. Dr. Vasquez explained that they were conducting a routine background investigation on a potential hire for their social services department. The candidate, Riley Martinez, had listed me as a personal reference on her employment application. However, when they'd attempted to verify her credentials and character, they discovered some discrepancies in her application history that raised concerns. Sacred Heart had a policy of conducting thorough background checks on all employees who would have access to patient information or vulnerable populations, even in administrative roles. During their investigation, they'd found records indicating that Riley had previously applied to multiple nursing programs under different names, and that several of those applications had been rejected due to character concerns. Dr. Vasquez said that Riley's current application didn't mention any previous nursing program applications or name changes. She was presenting herself as someone who had always worked in social services and data analysis with no background in healthcare education or training. More troubling, Dr. Vasquez continued, Riley's personal statement for the hospital position included a narrative about being inspired to work in healthcare after supporting a family member through recovery from severe burn injuries. She described herself as someone who understood the challenges faced by trauma survivors and their families. Dr. Vasquez had found my contact information through professional networks, as I was now known in patient safety circles for my work on healthcare accountability issues. She wondered if I might be able to provide some clarity about Riley's background and the family circumstances she'd referenced in her application. I told Dr. Vasquez that I'd be happy to discuss Riley's background, but that the conversation would require some context about our family history and my current professional responsibilities. I explained that I worked in patient safety myself and that I had firsthand experience with Riley's character and decision-making capabilities. We scheduled a formal interview for the following week, which would give me time to gather my documentation and prepare a comprehensive response. In the days leading up to that interview, I reflected on how much had changed since my college years. I'd built a career focused on protecting vulnerable patients from preventable harm. I'd become an expert in healthcare safety systems, risk assessment, and the processes designed to keep dangerous individuals away from patient care environments. My work had given me a deeper understanding of why character references mattered so much in healthcare settings. I'd seen the devastating consequences when individuals with histories of violence, dishonesty, or poor judgment gained access to vulnerable populations. I'd worked on cases involving healthcare workers who'd abused patients, stolen medications, or caused harm through reckless behavior. In every case, there had been warning signs that someone should have reported earlier. Family members who'd known about concerning behaviors but stayed silent, former employers who'd provided vague references rather than honest assessments, educational institutions that had overlooked red flags in favor of giving people second chances. My professional experience had reinforced my belief that protecting patients required uncomfortable honesty about people's histories, even when those people were family members. During my interview with Dr. Vasquez, I provided a comprehensive account of Riley's history. I described the incident from when I was 17, including the medical documentation that proved the deliberate nature of my injuries. I explained Riley's subsequent attempts to pursue nursing careers while misrepresenting her background and providing false information in applications. I also shared information about Riley's eventual acknowledgement of responsibility and her apparent efforts to address her behavior through therapy. I mentioned her work with the nonprofit organization and her decision to abandon nursing pursuits in favor of administrative roles.
However, I emphasized that Riley's current application contained the same types of misrepresentations that had characterized her previous applications. She was still using her experience with my injuries as part of her personal narrative, while omitting the crucial fact that she had been the one who caused those injuries. Dr. Vasquez asked pointed questions about Riley's current level of honesty and accountability. I explained that while Riley had made progress in therapy and had eventually acknowledged the truth about what she'd done, she appeared to be continuing patterns of selective disclosure and narrative manipulation in professional contexts. I told Dr. Vasquez that in my professional opinion as a patient safety coordinator, Riley's history demonstrated concerning patterns that were relevant to any healthcare employment decision. Her willingness to cause deliberate physical harm when frustrated, combined with her ongoing tendency to misrepresent her background, suggested that she posed potential risks to vulnerable populations. Dr. Vasquez thanked me for the detailed information and said that Sacred Heart would be conducting additional verification of the facts I'd shared. She mentioned that they took employee background investigations very seriously, particularly for positions involving access to patient information or contact with vulnerable individuals. 2 weeks later, I learned that Riley's application to Sacred Heart Medical Center had been rejected. The hospital's Human Resources Department had determined that her failure to disclose relevant background information, combined with concerns about her character and judgment, made her unsuitable for employment in a healthcare setting. But this rejection had consequences that extended beyond Riley's individual job search. Sacred Heart's investigation had uncovered a pattern of misrepresentation across multiple applications, which they reported to relevant professional organizations and licensing boards. Even though Riley wasn't seeking a licensed position, her behavior was flagged in databases used by healthcare employers to screen potential hires. This meant that other hospitals and healthcare organizations would be able to see that Riley had a history of providing false information in employment applications, even if they didn't have access to the specific details about her background. Jake called me a few days after the rejection to let me know how Riley was handling the news. He said she'd been devastated to learn that her past was continuing to affect her employment prospects, even in non-clinical roles. She'd apparently believed that her work in therapy and her honest acknowledgement of what she'd done to me had cleared the way for her to move forward professionally. Riley had been particularly upset to learn that I'd been the one to provide information to Sacred Heart. According to Jake, she felt betrayed because she'd assumed that her letters taking responsibility for her actions had repaired our relationship enough that I wouldn't actively work against her employment prospects. Jake said Riley was struggling to understand why her attempts at accountability weren't sufficient to overcome her past actions. She told him that she felt like she was being punished forever for something she'd done years ago, despite her efforts to change and make amends. I explained to Jake that accountability wasn't the same as rehabilitation, and that rehabilitation wasn't the same as qualification for positions involving vulnerable people. Riley's acknowledgement of what she'd done was an important step, but it didn't erase the fact that she demonstrated a willingness to cause deliberate harm and engage in sustained dishonesty. More importantly, I told Jake, Riley's recent application to Sacred Heart had included the same types of misrepresentations that had characterized her nursing applications. She was still selectively disclosing information and manipulating her personal narrative to gain employment in healthcare settings. Jake acknowledged that Riley's continued dishonesty in applications was problematic, but he wondered if there was any path forward for her to rebuild her life and find meaningful employment. He asked if I thought Riley would ever be able to overcome her past mistakes. I told Jake that rehabilitation was possible, but it required complete honesty and sustained demonstration of changed behavior over time. Riley would need to stop misrepresenting her background in applications, find employment outside of healthcare settings, and prove through her actions that she'd developed better judgment and coping strategies. I also explained that some career paths might be permanently close to her, and that accepting those limitations was part of taking genuine responsibility for her actions. Healthcare work required a level of trust and character that Riley had forfeited through her past behavior. Jake seemed to understand my perspective, though he remained sympathetic to his sister's situation. He said he'd encouraged Riley to work with her therapist on accepting the consequences of her actions and finding fulfillment in career paths that didn't involve vulnerable populations. Over the following months, I heard occasional updates about Riley through Jake. She'd eventually found employment with a technology company that provided data analysis services to various industries, including some healthcare clients. Her work involved analyzing trends and patterns in large data sets, with no direct contact with patients or access to confidential medical information. Riley had apparently been completely honest about her background during the hiring process. She disclosed her previous applications to healthcare programs and employers, explained the circumstances that had led to those rejections, and provided documentation of her therapy and accountability work. The technology company had appreciated her honesty and had determined that her past actions weren't relevant to the data analysis role she'd be performing. They'd hired her with the understanding that she'd never seek transfer to positions involving healthcare clients or sensitive populations. Jake said Riley seemed to be finding satisfaction in her new role and was finally accepting that her future lay outside of healthcare settings. She'd continued her therapy work and had started volunteering with organizations focused on preventing violence and promoting accountability.
More significantly, Riley had begun speaking publicly about her experiences with anger management and the consequences of deliberate harm. She'd given presentations to community groups about recognizing warning signs of escalating behavior and the importance of seeking help before actions caused irreversible damage. In these presentations, according to Jake, Riley was completely honest about what she'd done to me and why she'd done it. She used her own story as an example of how untreated anger and entitlement could lead to actions that hurt others and derailed her own future plans. I found myself cautiously hopeful about these developments. Riley appeared to be finally engaging in genuine accountability rather than just managing her image. She was using her experience to help others avoid similar mistakes rather than trying to hide from the consequences of her actions. But I also remained vigilant about her potential impact on vulnerable populations. When I learned that one of her community presentations was scheduled at a hospital conference on workplace violence prevention, I reached out to the organizers to provide context about Riley's background. I explained that while Riley appeared to be doing important work on accountability and violence prevention, her presentation to healthcare workers should include full disclosure about her history of deliberately causing patient-type injuries. Conference attendees should know that the speaker had a personal history of the type of violence she was discussing. The conference organizers appreciated the information and worked with Riley to ensure that her presentation included complete transparency about her background. Rather than undermining her message, this disclosure actually strengthened her credibility as someone who understood violence from the perpetrator's perspective. Riley's presentation was apparently well received, with audience members commenting that her first-hand experience with causing deliberate harm gave her unique insights into prevention strategies. Several healthcare workers approached her afterward to discuss implementing similar accountability programs in their own institutions. Jake told me that Riley had been nervous about disclosing her full history to the healthcare audience, but that she'd felt empowered by their positive response. She'd realized that her experiences could be valuable in prevention work as long as she was completely honest about her role in causing harm. This marked a turning point in Riley's approach to her past. Instead of trying to hide from what she'd done or minimize its significance, she began using it as a foundation for meaningful advocacy work. She developed expertise in violence prevention, accountability processes, and the systems designed to protect vulnerable populations from harm. Over the next few years, Riley built a reputation as a thoughtful and effective advocate for violence prevention and accountability. She worked with organizations developing policies to identify and address concerning behaviors before they escalated into harmful actions. She consulted with institutions on improving their screening processes for positions involving vulnerable populations. Most importantly, she did all of this work with complete transparency about her own history. She never again tried to hide the fact that she'd deliberately harmed a family member or misrepresented her background in applications. Her credibility came from her willingness to take full responsibility for her past actions while working to prevent others from making similar mistakes. My own career had continued to evolve during this time. I'd become a recognized expert in healthcare safety and patient protection, speaking at conferences and consulting with institutions on risk assessment and prevention strategies. My work often involved helping organizations develop better systems for screening potential employees and identifying concerning behaviors before they led to patient harm. Ironically, my experience with Riley had become one of my most valuable professional assets. I understood from personal experience how family dynamics could complicate the reporting of concerning behaviors and how important it was to create systems that encouraged honest disclosure even when it was difficult. I'd also learned that accountability and rehabilitation were possible, but that they required complete honesty and sustained commitment to change. Riley's eventual transformation had demonstrated that people could overcome serious character flaws, but only through genuine work and full acceptance of consequences. Our relationship remained limited but civil.
We occasionally encountered each other at conferences or professional events where we maintained polite interactions focused on our shared work in prevention and safety. We never rebuilt a personal relationship, but we'd found a way to coexist professionally while respecting the boundaries that our history had created. The most significant moment in this evolution came when Riley was invited to speak at a major patient safety conference where I was also presenting. The conference organizers wanted her to address the topic of healthcare employment screening and the importance of thorough background investigations. Riley approached me before her presentation to ask if I'd be comfortable with her referencing our shared history as part of her talk. She explained that she wanted to use our story as an example of how the character reference system was supposed to work, even when it involves difficult family dynamics. I told Riley that I had no objection to her using our experience in her presentation as long as she was completely accurate about what had happened and why. I said that if her story could help other healthcare institutions make better hiring decisions, then some good would have come from the harm she'd caused. Riley's presentation was powerful and well received. She described her deliberate assault on me, her subsequent attempts to hide her background while pursuing healthcare careers, and the importance of the character reference system in protecting patients from potentially harmful individuals. She emphasized that accountability didn't entitle someone to forgiveness or career opportunities, but that it was still necessary for genuine personal growth. She explained how her initial attempts at rehabilitation had failed because they were focused on managing consequences rather than accepting responsibility. Most importantly, she acknowledged that some career paths might be permanently closed to people who had demonstrated certain types of harmful behavior, and that accepting those limitations was part of taking genuine responsibility. The audience responded positively to Riley's honesty and insight. Several conference attendees approached her afterward to discuss implementing similar accountability measures in their own institutions. Others thanked her for her courage in speaking honestly about her past mistakes. After her presentation, Riley approached me again. She thanked me for my role in preventing her from gaining access to vulnerable patients during her nursing applications. She said she understood now that my honest character references had protected people who couldn't protect themselves. She also apologized again for the harm she'd caused me, both physical and emotional. She said she'd come to understand that the scarring on my arms was just the visible part of the damage she'd done, and that the family conflict and ongoing consequences had affected my life in ways she'd never fully considered. I accepted her apology, though I explained that acceptance didn't mean forgetting or fully trusting. I told her that I was glad she'd found a way to use her experience constructively, but that I'd always prioritize patient safety over family relationships when those interests conflicted. Riley said she understood and respected my position. She said she hoped her current work demonstrated genuine change, even if it couldn't repair the relationship we'd once had. As I reflected on our conversation, I realized that we'd both found ways to turn a traumatic experience into meaningful work that protected others from harm. Riley had become an effective advocate for violence prevention and accountability, while I'd built a career focused on healthcare safety and patient protection. The scars on my arms had faded significantly over the years, but they remained visible reminders of what had happened between us. They also served as symbols of survival, recovery, and the importance of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. Looking back, I could see that Dr. Chen's decision to document everything that day in the emergency room had been more prescient than either of us had realized. Her medical records had served not just as evidence of what Riley had done, but as the foundation for a system that had protected countless potential patients from harm. The character reference system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. When presented with honest information about someone's history and character, healthcare institutions had made responsible decisions to protect vulnerable populations. The temporary family conflict and personal costs had been worth it to prevent potential harm to people who would never know how they'd been protected. Most importantly, I'd learned that doing the right thing sometimes required choosing principle over popularity, truth over family harmony, and patient safety over personal relationships. Those choices hadn't always been comfortable, but they'd been necessary to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Riley's eventual transformation had been gratifying to witness, but it had also validated my original decisions. Her current effectiveness as a violence prevention advocate was built on a foundation of complete honesty and accountability that she'd only achieved after being prevented from pursuing her original career goals. If I'd provided false character references or stayed silent about her history, Riley might have gained access to vulnerable patients before developing the insight and accountability that now made her work meaningful. The system had protected both potential patients and Riley herself from the consequences of her unaddressed behavioral problems. As I continued my work in patient safety, I carried forward the lessons I'd learned from my experience with Riley: the importance of thorough documentation, honest character assessment, and the courage to speak difficult truths when vulnerable people might be at risk. Sometimes protecting others required accepting personal costs and family discord, but those sacrifices were always worth it when weighed against the potential harm that could be prevented through honest assessment and responsible decision-making. The burns Riley had inflicted on my arms had healed, but the knowledge that I used that experience to protect others from similar harm had given those scars a different meaning. They'd become symbols not just of what I'd survived, but of what I'd accomplished through the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.